In April of 145, while the world was still counting the dead of the Second World War, a farmer in Upper Egypt made a discovery that would challenge the very foundations of how we understand reality. Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for sabak, a soft, nitrogen-rich soil used as fertilizer, near the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs, close to the town of Nag Hammadi. His shovel struck something hard. He cleared away the sand and uncovered a large red earthenware jar, sealed and standing upright, as if it had been waiting. Muhammad hesitated. In the folk tradition of Upper Egypt, such jars were believed to contain jinn, spirits that could bring fortune or catastrophe, but his family was poor and the jar might contain gold. He raised his mattock and brought it down hard. The jar shattered. Inside there was no gold. Instead, he found 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus covered in a script he could not read. Disappointed, he dumped most of them on the ground. His mother later used some of the pages to kindle her oven. But a few of the codices survived. They made their way into the hands of local dealers, and from there into the black markets of Cairo. One was purchased by a Belgian antiquities dealer, and eventually gifted to the Jung Institute in Zurich. Others were acquired by the Coptic Museum in Cairo. When scholars finally began to translate them, they realized what had been found. A library of early Christian and Gnostic texts hidden for more than 16 centuries, containing cosmologies and theologies that had been declared heretical and systematically destroyed by the emerging Orthodox Church. Among these texts was a document called the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John. It tells a story that begins not with the creation of the world, but with something that came before, a realm of pure intelligences called Aeons, existing in a state of perfect unity and light, and it describes how one of those intelligences, a being named Sophia, whose name means wisdom, acted alone, without her consort, and in doing so broke the symmetry of eternity. From her thought, something incomplete was born, and from that incompleteness came the universe as we know it, matter, time, suffering, and death. This is not a story the Church wanted told. For nearly 2,000 years, it was suppressed, fragmented, and buried, but the texts survived. And the question they pose is older than any scripture, older than any philosophy. What if the world we live in is not a creation of love, but the result of an error? What if reality itself began as a mistake? Nag Hammadi sits on the west bank of the Nile, about 300 miles south of Cairo. The landscape is flat and agricultural near the river, but as you move west it rises into limestone cliffs and desert plateaus. The cliffs are riddled with caves, some natural, some carved by ancient hands. For centuries, Christian monks and ascetics used these caves as places of retreat and meditation. It was in one of these cliffs, near a massive boulder known locally as the Jabal, that the buried jar was found. The year 1945 was a time of upheaval. Egypt was technically independent, but still under heavy British influence. King Farouk ruled from Cairo, but his power was contested by nationalists, communists, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The war had devastated Europe, but Egypt had been a strategic hub, a crossroads of Allied operations, refugee flows, and intelligence networks. The country was flooded with soldiers, spies, and smugglers. Antiquities were valuable currency in this chaos. Artifacts passed through informal channels, from fellahin to middlemen to European collectors, often without any official record. When Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers unearthed the jar, they did not immediately understand its significance. They divided the codices among themselves. Some were sold in nearby towns. One ended up in the possession of a Coptic priest named Basilios Abd al-Masih, who showed it to a local history teacher. That teacher contacted Togo Mina, the director of the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Mina recognized the age and importance of the texts and began efforts to acquire them. But the process was slow. Egypt's antiquities laws were strict, and the black market was faster. By the time the Coptic Museum had secured most of the collection, one complete codex, later known as Codex I or the Jung Codex, had already been smuggled out of the country. It surfaced in Belgium, where it was purchased by a dealer who sold it to a private collector. In 1952, that collector donated it to the Jung Institute in Zurich in honour of Carl Jung's 77th birthday. Jung himself never fully studied it. He died in 1961, but the codex that bore his name would become one of the most important documents in the study of early Christianity. The complete Nag Hammadi library consists of 13 codices containing 52 separate texts. Most are written in Coptic, the latest stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written in a modified Greek alphabet. The texts themselves are translations from earlier Greek originals, most of which have been lost. The codices date from the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, but the ideas they contain are older, rooted in the intellectual ferment of the 1st and 2nd centuries, when Christianity was not yet a unified religion, but a collection of competing visions. Among the texts are Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene. There are apocalypses, prayers, hymns, and philosophical treatises, but the most striking documents are the cosmological ones, the ones that describe the origins of the universe not as the work of a benevolent creator, but as the consequence of a cosmic rupture. These are the Gnostic texts, and they tell a story that is strange, beautiful, and profoundly unsettling. The Apocryphon of John is the longest and most old of these cosmologies. It exists in 4 different versions found at Nag Hammadi, which suggests it was widely read and copied. The text is framed as a revelation given by the risen Christ to his disciple John, but the cosmology it describes is far older than Christianity. It draws on Platonic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and traditions that may reach back to Babylonian and Persian sources. It begins not with the creation of the world, but with something that precedes it. The pleroma, the fullness, a realm of pure being and thought. The text describes this realm as composed of aeons, eternal, luminous intelligences that exist in pairs or syzygies. These aeons are not gods in the traditional sense, and they are not personalities. They are principles or dimensions of consciousness itself. They have names like mind, truth, word, life, human, and church. They emanate in sequence from an unnameable source called Bythos, the depth, and together they form a perfect unity, totality without lack or division. But then something happens. One of the Aeons, Sophia, acts without her consort. She attempts to know the unknowable Father, the source beyond all thought, and from that act of solitary desire, something incomplete is born. This is where the Gnostic myth begins, and it is here that the story diverges radically from the biblical account of creation. For the Gnostics, the world is not made by God. It is made by a lesser being, a flawed entity born from an error in the divine realm. And humanity is not made in the image of a perfect creator, but is instead a mixture, part divine light, part cosmic mistake. To understand how such a cosmology could emerge, we must go back to Alexandria in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient Mediterranean, a city of libraries, schools, and cults, where Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, and emerging Christian thought collided and cross-pollinated. Founded by Alexander the Great in 321 BCE, Alexandria was designed to be a cosmopolitan centre. Its population included Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, and later Romans. The city was famous for its lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and for its library, which at its height contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars came from across the known world to study there. It was a place where ideas circulated freely, where old traditions met new philosophies, and where syncretism, the blending of different religious and intellectual systems, was not an exception but the norm. In this environment, Christianity was one movement among many. It had not yet developed a fixed canon of scripture or a centralized authority. There were no creeds, no councils, no popes. Instead, there were teachers, each offering their own interpretation of the life and message of Jesus. Some emphasized his ethical teachings, Others focused on his death and resurrection. Still others saw him as a revealer of hidden knowledge, a guide to the divine realm. Among these teachers were the Gnostics. The term Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. But this was not ordinary knowledge. It was not information that could be learned from books or taught in schools. It was direct, experiential knowledge of the divine, a kind of spiritual awakening or illumination. The Gnostics believed that this knowledge was the key to salvation. To be saved was not to be forgiven, but to be awakened, to remember one's true origin and return to the divine realm. The Gnostic movement was not monolithic. There were many different schools and teachers, each with their own variations on the central themes. But certain ideas recur across the different texts. One is the notion of a transcendent, unknowable God, far removed from the material world. Another is the belief that the material world itself is a kind of prison or error, created by a lesser deity. A third is the conviction that human beings contain a spark of the divine, a fragment of light trapped in matter, and that salvation consists in liberating that spark and returning it to its source. These ideas were not invented by the Gnostics. They had deep roots in earlier philosophical traditions. One of the most important was Platonism. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, had distinguished between the world of eternal forms, perfect immaterial archetypes, and the world of physical objects, which were merely imperfect copies. He described the creation of the world in his dialogue Timaeus, where a divine craftsman called the Demiurge fashions the cosmos by looking to the eternal forms as a model. But Plato's Demiurge is benevolent. He creates the best possible world. The Gnostics took this figure and transformed it. In their cosmology, the Demiurge is not benevolent. He is ignorant and arrogant, a false god who mistakes himself for the ultimate creator. Another influence was Jewish mysticism. In the centuries before and after the time of Jesus, Jewish thinkers were developing elaborate speculations about the nature of God, the structure of the heavens, and the origin of evil. Some of these speculations involved intermediary figures, angels, powers, emanations, who mediated between the transcendent God and the created world. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, developed a complex theology in which the logos, the word or reason of God, served as the instrument of creation. The Gnostics absorbed these ideas and reconfigured them, turning the intermediaries into aeons and reimagining the logos as one principle among many in a vast hierarchy of being. There were also Egyptian and Persian influences. The Egyptians had long traditions of wisdom literature, creation myths, and funerary texts describing the journey of the soul through the afterlife. The Persians, particularly the followers of Zoroaster, had a dualistic cosmology in which the world was a battleground between the forces of light and darkness, good and evil. The Gnostics were not simply borrowing from these traditions, they were synthesizing them, creating something new. In Alexandria, this synthesis was happening in private homes, in informal schools, and in the workshops of scribes and copyists. Teachers like Valentinus, Basilides, and Carpocrates gathered followers and developed intricate systems of thought. They wrote treatises, composed hymns, and performed rituals. They debated with each other and with representatives of what would later become Orthodox Christianity. The letters of Paul were already in circulation, and so were the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and eventually John. But there were other Gospels too, secret Gospels, Gospels that emphasized hidden teachings and mystical experiences. The Gnostic teachers did not see themselves as heretics. They saw themselves as the true Christians, the ones who understood the deeper meaning of Jesus' message. For them, Jesus was not primarily a sacrifice for sin. He was a revealer, a messenger from the higher realm who came to awaken humanity from its slumber. His message was not about obedience or faith, but about knowledge and liberation. The cosmology presented in texts like the Apocryphon of John is complex and highly detailed. It describes a realm that exists before and above the material universe, a realm called the Pleroma, meaning fullness or totality. The pleroma is not a place in the ordinary sense, it is a state of perfect being without division, without time, without lack. It is the source from which all things emanate and to which all things ultimately return. At the centre of the pleroma is the Father, also called the invisible spirit, Bythos, or the depth. This Father is utterly transcendent. He cannot be described, named, or comprehended. He is beyond being and non-being, beyond thought and silence. He is the ineffable source, the origin that has no origin. From the Father, the first Aeon emanates. This is Barbelo, also called the first thought or the mother. Barbelo is the Father's self-reflection, the first movement of consciousness. She is described as light, life, and knowledge, the first differentiation within the unity. Barbelo is both feminine and divine, a figure of immense power and beauty. From the union of the Father and Barbelo, other Aeons come forth in pairs. First is the self-generated one, also called Christ or the Son. Then come mind and truth, word and life, and human and church. These Aeons are not separate beings. They are aspects or dimensions of the divine reality, each representing a different mode of awareness or existence. Together they form the totality of the pleroma, a perfect, self-sufficient whole. The Aeons exist in a state of harmony and mutual indwelling. They are characterized by rest, silence, and unity. There is no desire, no striving, no incompleteness. Everything that can be thought or known is already fully present. The pleroma is eternity itself, not as an endless duration of time, but as the absence of time, a simultaneity in which all possibilities are actualized at once. But the pleroma is not static. It is generative. From the interactions of the Aeons, new levels of being continually unfold. The texts describe these emanations in mathematical or musical terms as a series of harmonics, or as a branching tree of light. The imagery is often visual, light refracting through transparent forms, or water flowing from a single spring into multiple streams. The Gnostic texts also emphasize the role of thought in this process. The Aeons are not material. They are intelligences, thoughts thinking themselves. The pleroma is a realm of pure consciousness, and the act of emanation is an act of self-knowing. The Father knows himself through Barbelo, and Barbelo knows herself through the subsequent Aeons. Knowledge and being are identical. To know is to be, and to be is to know. This cosmology is clearly indebted to the philosophy of Plato and his successors. In Plato's dialogues, especially the Parmenides and the Timaeus, there are extended discussions of the one, the many, and the process by which unity gives rise to multiplicity. Later Platonists, particularly Plotinus in the 3rd century, developed these ideas into a full-scale metaphysical system. Plotinus described a hierarchy of being with the one at the top, followed by the intellect, the soul, and finally the material world. Each level emanates from the one above it, like light radiating from a source. The Gnostics were clearly familiar with these ideas, but they introduced a crucial twist. For Plotinus, the process of emanation is natural and necessary. The one overflows into multiplicity because it is the nature of the good to give itself. There is no tragedy, no loss. But for the Gnostics, something goes wrong. The chain of emanation is broken by an act of individual will. One of the Aeons desires to know the Father directly without mediation, and that desire, that act of solitary reaching, introduces a flaw into the perfect system. This is the moment when myth and metaphysics converge. The Gnostic texts describe this event with great emotional intensity. It is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a story about longing, isolation, and the consequences of acting without wholeness. The Aeon who acts alone is Sophia, wisdom. In the Apocryphon of John, she is described as the youngest of the Aeons, the last in the sequence of emanations. She dwells within the pleroma, surrounded by her consort and by the other Aeons. She is part of the totality, a note in the eternal harmony. But Sophia conceives a desire. She wishes to comprehend the Father, the source of all. The text says she sought to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the spirit and without her consort. This is a subtle but profound transgression. The Aeons always act in pairs, in syzygy. The pairing represents balance, completeness, the union of active and receptive principles. To act alone is to act incompletely. It is to introduce a symmetry into a system of perfect symmetry. Why does Sophia do this? The text gives no clear answer. Some versions suggest it is a natural consequence of her position. She is the farthest from the Father, the most distant from the source. Others hint at a kind of divine ambition, a desire to imitate the Father's creative power. Still others frame it as innocence, a kind of naivete. Sophia does not understand the consequences of her action. The result is immediate and catastrophic. From Sophia's solitary thought, an offspring is produced. But because the act was incomplete, the offspring is incomplete. It has form, but it is defective. The text describes it as an abortion, something born prematurely, without the fullness of being. Sophia is horrified by what she has produced. She tries to hide it, to veil it from the other Aeons. She feels shame, a new and terrible emotion, unknown in the Pleroma. The offspring is given a name, Yaldabaoth. In some texts, he is also called Saklas, the fool or Samael, or the blind god. He is described as having the face of a lion and the body of a serpent, a chimeric creature combining power and cunning with ignorance and pride. Unlike the Aeons, Yaldabaoth is not composed of light. He is dense, material, a being of shadow and flame. Sophia, in her distress, casts Yaldabaoth out of the Pleroma. He falls downward, away from the realm of light, into a void. He has no knowledge of the world above. He does not know that he is the product of a flaw. He believes himself to be the only being in existence, the first and the greatest. The text records his declaration, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." This pronouncement is an echo and an inversion of the biblical God's self-proclamation in the book of Isaiah, "I am the Lord and there is no other." For the Gnostics, this was not a statement of monotheistic truth, but of cosmic arrogance. Yaldabaoth is not the true God. He is a false god, a usurper who mistakes his own limited realm for the totality of being. But Yaldabaoth is not powerless. He has inherited a portion of his mother's light, a fragment of the divine substance. With this light he creates. He fashions a realm of his own, a counterfeit heaven, a parody of the Pleroma. He produces beings to serve him, beings called archons, rulers or authorities. These archons are personifications of cosmic and psychological forces, ignorance, desire, fear, envy, wrath. Together, they form a hierarchy, a structure of domination and control. Yaldabaoth becomes the ruler of this lower realm. He is called the demiurge, the craftsman, the builder. But his creation is fundamentally flawed. It is based on imitation without understanding, power without wisdom. It is a world of limitation, suffering, and death. And at the center of this world, he decides to create a being in his own image, a being called Adam. The figure of the demiurge has a long and complex history in Western thought. As mentioned earlier, Plato used the term in the Timaeus to describe the divine craftsman who shapes the material world according to the eternal forms. But Plato's demiurge is good. He looks to the perfect patterns and creates the best possible cosmos. He is limited by the nature of matter, which is chaotic and resistant to order. But he is not evil. He is a benevolent artisan, doing the best he can with imperfect materials. The Gnostics took this figure and inverted it. For them, the demiurge is not good. He is ignorant, arrogant, and jealous. He creates the world not as an act of love, but as an act of domination. He wants to be worshipped. He wants to trap souls within his creation so that they will serve him and feed him with their prayers and sacrifices. He is, in the language of the Gnostic texts, a tyrant. This inversion was shocking to many ancient readers, and it remains shocking today. It implies that the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God who creates the world in Genesis, who gives the law to Moses, who demands obedience and punishes disobedience, is not the ultimate God but a lesser, flawed being. For the Gnostics, the God of Genesis is Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, and the world he creates is not a paradise but a prison. The Apocryphon of John provides a detailed account of this creation. Yaldabaoth, together with his archons, fashions a human body. They model it on the divine human that exists in the Pleroma, an image that Yaldabaoth glimpsed reflected in the waters of chaos. But the body they create is heavy, dense, and lifeless. It lies on the ground like a corpse. The archons have the power to form matter, but they cannot give it life. At this point the text introduces a crucial intervention. Sophia, still dwelling above, repents of her error. She prays to the Father for help. The Father hears her and sends forth a power, sometimes identified with Christ or the Logos, to assist her. This power descends into the lower realm and tricks Yaldabaoth. It causes him to blow his own breath, his own portion of divine light, into the nostrils of Adam, and when he does, Adam comes to life. This moment is the Gnostic reinterpretation of Genesis 2:7, where God breathes the breath of life into Adam. But here, the act has a different meaning. The breath that animates Adam is not the breath of the true God. It is the stolen light of Sophia, now passed through Yaldabaoth and into the human being. Adam contains within himself a fragment of the divine, a spark that comes from the Pleroma, but which is now trapped in a material body created by ignorant powers. The archons immediately recognize their mistake. They see that Adam has more wisdom and power than they do. He is capable of thought, of self-awareness, of choice. They become jealous and afraid. They decide to imprison him further. They create additional layers of matter around him, flesh, bones, organs, senses. They bind him to the cycles of time, to hunger and fatigue, to pleasure and pain. They place him in a garden, a controlled environment where they can observe and manipulate him. But the divine light within Adam cannot be completely suppressed. It calls out for liberation, and the Father, hearing this cry, sends another messenger, a figure who will awaken Adam to his true nature. The Gnostic cosmology does not stop with the creation of Adam. It extends into a detailed mapping of the structure of the cosmos, a structure that is both physical and spiritual, both literal and symbolic. According to the texts, the demiurge and his archons create 7 planetary spheres, one for each of the 7 classical planets: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each sphere is governed by an archon, a ruler who embodies a particular vice or limitation. The names of these archons vary across different texts. They often correspond to qualities like ignorance, envy, wrath, desire, and fear. These spheres are arranged in a hierarchy, with the Moon closest to the Earth and Saturn the farthest. Together they form a kind of cosmic onion, layers upon layers of enclosure. The soul, descending from the Pleroma into incarnation, must pass through each of these spheres. As it does, it acquires a garment, a layer of material or psychic substance corresponding to that sphere. By the time the soul reaches the earth and enters a body, it has accumulated 7 such garments, each binding it more tightly to the material realm. This cosmology was not invented by the Gnostics. It was the standard astronomical model of the ancient world, inherited from Babylonian astrology and refined by Greek scientists like Ptolemy. The 7 planets, moving against the fixed background of the stars, were seen as the primary actors in the cosmos. Their positions and their movements were believed to influence events on Earth, hence the practice of astrology. But the Gnostics gave this model a moral and spiritual interpretation. The planets were not neutral, they were agents of the demiurge, gatekeepers and jailers. The soul's descent through the spheres was a fall, a progressive loss of freedom and light, and salvation, gnosis, consisted in reversing this process, stripping away the garments, ascending back through the spheres, and returning to the pleroma. The texts describe this ascent in vivid, ritualistic terms. The soul must know the names of the archons, the passwords, and the formulas that will allow our passage. It must confront each ruler and declare its divine origin. In some versions, the soul must also perform acts of defiance or mockery, showing that it is not subject to the archon's authority. The journey is dangerous. The archons do not want to let go of what they consider theirs. They will use deception, fear, and force to keep the soul bound. This cosmology had profound psychological and existential implications. It meant that the visible universe, the world of stars, planets, and elements, was not ultimate reality. It was a construct, a system of control, and human beings, by virtue of the divine spark within them, were fundamentally alien to this system. They did not belong here. They were exiles, prisoners, sparks of light trapped in total darkness. This is why the Gnostics spoke of the world with such negativity. It was not that they hated matter itself, it was that they saw matter as a form of imprisonment and the visible cosmos as a trap. To live in the world without gnosis was to live in ignorance of one's true nature. It was to be hypnotized by the illusions of the archons, to mistake the prison for home. The story of Adam's creation continues with the introduction of Eve. In the Apocryphon of John, Eve is not simply Adam's companion, she is the agent of his awakening. The text describes how the demiurge, jealous of Adam's superior wisdom, decides to extract that wisdom from him. He casts Adam into a deep sleep and removes a portion of his power, the divine spark, intending to trap it in a second body. But the plan backfires. The power takes the form of a woman, and when Adam awakens and sees her, he recognizes her as his own true self, his spiritual counterpart. In the biblical Genesis, Eve is made from Adam's rib and is immediately subordinate to him. In the Gnostic version, Eve is the manifestation of the divine principle within Adam, the part of him that retains the memory of the pleroma. She is called Zoe, meaning life, or sometimes the instructor. She is not deceived by the demiurge. She is the one who brings knowledge. The Gnostic texts reinterpret the story of the Garden of Eden in light of this inversion. The garden is not a paradise. It is a controlled environment, a place of confinement. The demiurge places Adam and Eve there and commands them not to eat from the tree of knowledge. He tells them that if they do, they will die. But this is a lie. The truth is the opposite. Eating from the tree will give them knowledge, and with knowledge, freedom. Enter the serpent. In the biblical account, the serpent is the villain, the tempter who leads humanity into sin. But in the Gnostic text, the serpent is a saviour. It is identified with Christ or with Sophia, or with a divine emissary sent to awaken Adam and Eve. The serpent tells them the truth. You will not die, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. Eve listens and eats, Adam follows, and their eyes are indeed opened. They become aware. They see that they are naked, not literally, but spiritually. They see that they have been deceived, that the demiurge is not the true God, and that the world he has made is not their true home. This awareness is painful. It is the beginning of suffering, but it is also the beginning of freedom. The demiurge reacts with rage. He expels Adam and Eve from the garden. He curses them with toil, pain, and death. He places cherubim with flaming swords to guard the way back to the tree of life. But the damage, from his perspective, has been done. Humanity now has the potential for gnosis. The spark has been ignited. This reversal, making the serpent a hero and the creator a tyrant, was one of the most scandalous aspects of Gnostic teaching. It was a direct challenge to Jewish and Christian orthodoxy. It implied that obedience was not a virtue but a form of slavery, and that the pursuit of knowledge was not sin but salvation. For the Gnostics, the story of Eden was an allegory. Adam and Eve represented every human being. The garden was the world. The demiurge was the ego, or the social order, or any system that demands conformity and punishes curiosity. The serpent was the inner voice, the intuition of something higher, the discontent that drives one to question and seek. The Gnostic movement was not a single church or institution. It was a loose network of teachers, schools and communities spread across the Eastern Mediterranean. These teachers were charismatic figures who attracted followers through their eloquence, their claim to possess secret knowledge, and their promise of spiritual liberation. One of the most famous was Valentinus. Born in Egypt around the year 100, Valentinus was educated in Alexandria and later moved to Rome, where he taught for several decades. According to the church historian Eusebius, Valentinus was considered for the position of Bishop of Rome, what would later become the papacy, but was passed over, possibly because his teachings were too unorthodox. Instead, he founded his own school, which became one of the most influential Gnostic movements of the 2nd century. Valentinus developed a highly sophisticated cosmology, even more elaborate than the one found in the Apocryphon of John. He described the pleroma as containing 30 eons, arranged in a complex hierarchy. He introduced the concept of the limit or boundary, a principle that separated the pleroma from the lower realm and prevented the error of Sophia from contaminating the higher world. He also emphasized the role of Christ as the Saviour, who descends from the pleroma to gather up the scattered sparks of light and restore them to their source. Valentinus wrote hymns, letters, and treatises. Only fragments of his writings survive, preserved in the polemical works of his opponents. One of these fragments is a meditation on the heart. From the beginning you have been immortal, and you are children of eternal life. You wanted death to be distributed to yourselves so that you might spend it and consume it, and that death might die in you and through you. For when you dissolve the world and are not yourselves dissolved, you are lords over creation and all corruption. This passage encapsulates the Gnostic attitude. The world is something to be dissolved, not affirmed. The true self is immortal, untouched by decay. And death, physical death, the death of the ego, the death of illusions, is not to be feared but embraced as a means of liberation. Another prominent teacher was Basilides, also from Alexandria. Basilides taught in the early 2nd century and was known for his complex numerology and his theory of cosmic evolution. According to his system, the universe unfolds in a series of stages, beginning with an unborn father who generates nous, or mind, which in turn generates logos, or word, and so on. Basilides also spoke of a great ignorance that descended upon the world, a kind of cosmic sleep, and of a redeemer figure who comes to awaken those who are capable of hearing. Carpocrates, another 2nd century teacher, emphasized moral freedom. He taught that the soul must experience all things, good and evil, pleasure and pain, in order to be liberated from karma and the cycle of reincarnation. This was a controversial teaching, as it seemed to condone immorality. Carpocrates' critics accused him of libertinism, of encouraging his followers to engage in forbidden acts as a form of spiritual practice. Whether these accusations were true or exaggerated is hard to say, but they contributed to the growing perception that Gnostics were dangerous, subversive, and a threat to social order. The Gnostic communities did not have churches or temples in the traditional sense. They met in private homes, often in secret, to avoid persecution. Their rituals included prayers, hymns, readings from sacred texts, and symbolic acts like anointing and baptism. But these rituals were understood differently than in Orthodox Christianity. They were not means of receiving grace from an external God. They were enactments of interior transformation, dramatizations of the soul's journey from ignorance to knowledge. Initiation into a Gnostic community involved instruction in the myths and cosmologies, often in stages. New members might first hear simplified versions of the stories, and only later, once they had proven their commitment, would they be taught the deeper meanings. This practice of graded revelation, esoteric teaching reserved for the elect, was common in many ancient mystery religions, and it reinforced the Gnostic self-understanding as a spiritual elite, a remnant of those capable of awakening. But as the Gnostic movement grew, so did opposition. From the perspective of emerging Christian orthodoxy, Gnosticism was not just wrong, it was as dangerous. It threatened the unity and authority of the Church. It had undermined the idea of a good creator and a benevolent providential order. It encouraged individualism and spiritual elitism, and it drew people away from the communal practices, baptism, Eucharist, obedience to bishops, that were becoming the hallmarks of mainstream Christianity. The first major anti-Gnostic writer was Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, who wrote his massive work against heresies around the year 180. Irenaeus had lived in Asia Minor and had heard stories about the Gnostic teachers. He set out to refute them systematically, exposing what he saw as their errors and absurdities. He described their cosmologies in detail, often our only source for these systems, and then dismantled them with philosophical and theological arguments. Irenaeus accused the Gnostics of arrogance. They claimed to possess secret knowledge that the apostles had not taught. They set themselves above the scriptures and above the tradition of the Church. They invented elaborate myths to justify their rejection of the world and the body. And worst of all, from Irenaeus' perspective, they denied the goodness of creation and the incarnation of Christ in a real, physical body. For Irenaeus, the doctrine of the incarnation was central. God had become flesh in Jesus Christ. This meant that matter was not evil. It was capable of bearing the divine. The body was not a prison, but a temple. And the physical world, though fallen and marred by sin, was still fundamentally good. Still the creation of the one true God. Irenaeus also argued for a fixed canon of Scripture and for apostolic succession, the idea that the true teaching of Jesus had been passed down through a chain of authorized bishops, beginning with the apostles themselves. Against the Gnostic claim to secret traditions, Irenaeus asserted public verifiable tradition. Against their proliferation of texts and revelations, he insisted on a closed set of authoritative books, the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, and a few other texts that would eventually become the New Testament. Other church fathers followed Irenaeus' lead. Tertullian in North Africa, Hippolytus in Rome, Origen in Alexandria, all wrote polemics against the Gnostics. They called them heretics, corrupters of the faith, agents of the devil. They warned Christians not to attend their meetings or read their books. They used mockery and ridicule, portraying the Gnostics as pretentious, absurd, and sexually deviant. But the real turning point came in the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. In 313, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians. By 380, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity was declared the state religion, and other religions were outlawed. With imperial backing, the Orthodox Church had the power to enforce its doctrines. Councils were convened to define correct belief. The Council of Nicaea in 325 established the doctrine of the Trinity and condemned Arianism, a different heresy. The Council of Constantinople in 381 reaffirmed these decisions. Other councils would follow, each refining and defending orthodoxy. The Gnostics had no such councils. They had no bishops, no central authority, no imperial support. They could not defend themselves institutionally, and so they were systematically marginalized. Their books were burned, their teachers were exiled or killed, their communities dissolved. By the end of the 4th century, Gnosticism as an organized movement had largely disappeared. It survived only in fragments, in isolated sects like the Manichaeans, in underground traditions, in the folklore and mysticism of later centuries, but it was no longer a visible public force. The disappearance of Gnosticism was not a peaceful fade, it was violent. The 3rd and 4th centuries saw waves of persecution, not only of Gnostics specifically, but of all non-Orthodox Christians. These persecutions were carried out by Roman emperors who saw religious diversity as a threat to political stability. The persecution under Decius in 250 required all citizens to perform sacrifices to the Roman gods and obtain certificates proving their compliance. Those who refused were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Christians of all kinds, Orthodox and Gnostic alike, were targeted. But the Gnostics, lacking institutional structures, were particularly vulnerable. They could not appeal to bishops or organize mass resistance. They could only hide, flee, or submit. The persecution under Diocletian in 303 was even more severe. Diocletian ordered the destruction of Christian scriptures and places of worship. Clergy were arrested. Lay people were forced to recant or face death. The persecution lasted for nearly a decade and resulted in thousands of deaths. But ironically, these persecutions may have inadvertently preserved some Gnostic texts. When Christian communities anticipated raids, they hid their most precious manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts were buried in jars and sealed in caves, exactly like the Nag Hammadi codices. The intention was to protect them temporarily until the danger passed. But in many cases, the communities themselves did not survive, and the texts remained hidden for centuries. After Constantine legalized Christianity, the violence did not stop. It simply changed direction. Now it was Christians persecuting other Christians. Orthodox bishops, backed by imperial authority, moved against heretics with zeal. The Gnostic teacher Priscillian, who led a movement in Spain in the late 4th century, was tried for heresy and executed in 385, the first Christian to be executed by other Christians for theological reasons. His writings were burned and his followers were scattered. In Egypt, monks and bishops destroyed pagan temples and libraries. The famous Library of Alexandria, already diminished by fire and neglect, suffered further losses. Philosophical schools were closed. Pagan and Gnostic texts were systematically hunted down and destroyed. By the early 5th century, the intellectual landscape of the ancient Mediterranean had been transformed. A once diverse ecosystem of ideas had been replaced by a monoculture of orthodoxy. But even as the institutional church was consolidating, a different form of Christianity was emerging in the deserts of Egypt: monasticism. Beginning in the 3rd century, Christians seeking a more radical form of devotion retreated into the wilderness. They lived as hermits in caves, or joined communities of ascetics in remote locations. They fasted, prayed, and copied manuscripts. These monks were not Gnostics, most of them adhered to orthodox teachings, but they preserved some Gnostic texts, perhaps out of scholarly interest, or perhaps because they did not always draw sharp distinctions between heretical and orthodox writings. It is likely that the Nag Hammadi codices were copied by monks in one of the nearby monasteries, Pachomian communities that were centres of Christian learning and manuscript production. Why would Orthodox monks preserve heretical texts? Scholars have debated this question. Some suggest that the texts were valued for their mystical and ascetic themes, which resonated with monastic spirituality. Others believe the codices may have been hidden by a monk who secretly sympathized with Gnostic ideas. Still others propose that the library was simply a collection of diverse texts used for study and debate, and that the decision to bury them came only when external pressure, perhaps from a bishop, made it dangerous to keep them. Whatever the reason, the burial of the codices around the year 400 marks the end of an era. After that, Gnostic voices fall silent in the historical record. For more than 15 centuries, the Gnostic Gospels and cosmologies existed only in fragments and in the polemical summaries of their opponents. From the 5th century onward, the Christian world was dominated by the orthodoxy established at Nicaea and Constantinople. The theology of Augustine of Hippo, emphasizing the original sin, divine grace, and the authority of the institutional church, became the intellectual foundation of Western Christianity. In the East, Byzantine theologians developed their own synthesis, equally dismissive of Gnostic ideas. But Gnosticism did not entirely vanish. It survived in transmuted forms, in movements that were branded heretical and suppressed, but which kept alive some of the core intuitions of the ancient Gnostics. One of these was Manichaeism. Founded in the 3rd century by the prophet Mani, Manichaeism was a dualistic religion that drew on Gnostic, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist sources. Mani taught that the universe was a battleground between light and darkness, good and evil. The material world was created by the forces of darkness as a trap for particles of light, souls that must be liberated through knowledge and ascetic practice. Manichaeism spread rapidly across the Roman Empire, Central Asia, and even into China. Augustine himself was a Manichaean for 9 years before converting to Orthodox Christianity. But by the 6th century, Manichaeism was banned throughout the Roman world and its texts were destroyed. In the medieval period, Gnostic themes re-emerged in the Bogomils of the Balkans and the Cathars of southern France. The Bogomils, active from the 10th to 15th centuries, taught that the visible world was created by Satan and that Christ was a purely spiritual being who came to teach the path of escape. The Cathars, who flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries, held similar beliefs. They practiced extreme asceticism, rejected the sacraments of the Catholic Church, and were organised into a parallel church structure with their own bishops and rituals. The Catholic Church responded with horror. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, a 20-year military campaign to exterminate the Cathars. Entire towns were burned. Thousands were slaughtered. The crusade culminated in the siege of Montségur in 1244, where the last Cathar stronghold fell. More than 200 Cathars were burned at the stake in a single day. The few who escaped were hunted down by the Inquisition, which was established specifically to root out heresy. The Inquisition was a systematic apparatus of surveillance, interrogation, and punishment. Suspected heretics were arrested, tortured, and forced to confess. Those who recanted were sometimes spared, though often sentenced to lifelong imprisonment. Those who refused were burned alive. The Inquisition's records, detailed transcripts of trials and confessions, provide some of the only sources we have for Cathar beliefs. The Cathars themselves left almost no writings. Their texts, like those of the ancient Gnostics, were destroyed. By the end of the 13th century, Catharism was extinct, and with it the last visible manifestation of the Gnostic impulse in Western Christianity disappeared. The long night had begun, but outside the Christian world, some Gnostic ideas survived. In the Islamic tradition, philosophers and mystics preserved and transformed elements of Gnostic cosmology, often without being aware of their origins. One key figure was Al-Farabi, a 10th century philosopher in Baghdad. Al-Farabi synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology, but he also drew on Neoplatonic sources that contained echoes of Gnostic thought. He described the universe as a series of emanations from the One, a hierarchy of intellects descending from the divine to the material. Human salvation for Al-Farabi involved the perfection of the intellect and its eventual return to unity with the active intellect, the cosmic mind. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, developed these ideas further. In his visionary recitals, mystical narratives written in Persian, Ibn Sina described the soul's journey through a dark and perilous world, guided by an angelic figure toward the world of light. These narratives are strikingly Gnostic in tone, though Ibn Sina likely did not have direct access to Gnostic texts. He was drawing on a shared intellectual heritage, the Neoplatonism of Plotinus and Proclus, which had absorbed some Gnostic elements, and which was transmitted to the Islamic world through translations of Greek philosophical texts. The most explicitly Gnostic Islamic thinker was Suhrawardi, a 12th century Persian philosopher who founded the Illuminationist school. Suhrawardi taught that the universe is composed of lights, hierarchies of luminous beings descending from the light of lights, the ultimate source. The material world is darkness, the absence of light, and human beings are exiles from the realm of light, trapped in bodies and longing for return. Suhrawardi was executed for heresy in 1191, but his writings survived and influenced later Islamic mysticism, particularly Sufism. These Islamic philosophers and mystics did not call themselves Gnostics, and that they would not have recognized the ancient Gnostic texts if they had encountered them. But they were working in the same tradition, a tradition that saw the material world as inferior, the soul as divine in origin, and knowledge as the key to salvation. In this sense, the Gnostic impulse never died. It went underground, changed names, adapted to new religious and cultural contexts, and continued to resurface wherever people ask the question, is this world all there is? The transmission of these ideas from the Islamic world back to Christian Europe happened through a complex network of translations. In the 12th century, European scholars began travelling to Spain and Sicily, regions where Christians, Muslims, and Jews coexisted, and where Arabic texts were being translated into Latin. Through these translations, the works of Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and others entered the European intellectual tradition. They influenced medieval Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and later Renaissance humanists like Marsilio Ficino. Ficino, working in Florence in the 15th century, translated the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greco-Egyptian mystical texts that had been composed around the same time as the Gnostic Gospels. The Hermetic text spoke of gnosis, of the soul's ascent, of the world as a cosmic prison. Ficino saw these texts as ancient wisdom compatible with Christianity. He did not know that he was rediscovering ideas that the Church had once tried to erase. Jump forward 5 centuries to the 1940s. Europe is in ruins. The war has ended, but the world is entering a new kind of conflict, the Cold War, a battle of ideologies and narratives. And in this context, the discovery at Nag Hammadi takes on a special significance. It is not just an archaeological find, it is a revelation about the nature of religious authority, the construction of orthodoxy, and the suppression of alternative voices. When the codices first appeared on the antiquities market in Cairo, few people understood their importance. They were written in Coptic, a language few scholars could read fluently. They were fragmentary, their pages brittle and damaged. But one scholar, Jean Dorès, a French archaeologist working in Egypt, recognized their significance. In 1947, he published the first announcement of the discovery, describing the texts as a Gnostic library. The term Gnostic was familiar to scholars, but only through the writings of the Church Fathers. No one had seen actual Gnostic texts in their original form. Now suddenly, there were entire codices, complete books offering a direct window into a lost world. But the codices were scattered. Some were in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, under the control of the Egyptian government. One was in Zurich, in private hands. Dorès and other scholars lobbied for the text to be made available for study. It took years. The Egyptian government was protective of its antiquities, and there were concerns about smuggling and illegal sales. Political instability, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 and the Suez Crisis of 1956, further delayed the process. Finally, in the 1960s, an international team of scholars was assembled to transcribe, translate, and publish the texts. The project was led by James Robinson, an American scholar, who organized a collaborative effort involving Coptic specialists from around the world. The first complete English translation of the Nag Hammadi library was published in 1907, more than 30 years after the discovery. The impact was immediate and profound. For the first time, scholars and general readers could encounter Gnostic thought directly, without the filter of hostile church fathers. The text revealed a Christianity far more diverse and complex than anyone had imagined. They showed that in the 1st and 2nd centuries, there was no single Christian orthodoxy, but a spectrum of beliefs and practices. They challenged the idea that the New Testament canon was self-evident or divinely ordained, showing that many other Gospels and Revelations had circulated and been taken seriously by early Christian communities. The Apocryphon of John in particular captured the imagination of scholars and the public. Its cosmology was intricate, philosophical, and utterly alien to mainstream Christian teaching. It presented a vision of the universe as fundamentally flawed, and of humanity as containing a divine spark capable of transcending the material realm. It was a myth of awakening, of resistance, of the courage to question authority and seek one's own truth. The publication of the Nag Hammadi texts sparked a fierce debate. What did these texts mean? How should they be interpreted? And what did they say about the origins of Christianity? One of the first major interpreters was Hans Jonas, a German philosopher who had studied under Martin Heidegger. Jonas's book The Gnostic Religion, first published in 1958 and revised after the Nag Hammadi discovery, argued that Gnosticism represented a profound existential stance, a recognition of the absurdity and alienation of human existence in a meaningless cosmos. For Jonas, the Gnostic myth was not a literal cosmology, but a symbolic expression of existential dread. The demiurge was a metaphor for the impersonal forces that govern the world. The pleroma was the human longing for meaning and transcendence, and gnosis was the act of radical self-awareness, the decision to live authentically in the face of absurdity. This existentialist reading resonated with mid-20th century intellectuals who were grappling with the horrors of the world wars and the threat of nuclear annihilation. The Gnostic myth seemed to speak to the modern condition, the sense of being trapped in a system one did not create and cannot control, the awareness that the authorities who claim to have answers are often ignorant or malevolent, and the desperate hope that there is something beyond, some spark of light, some source of meaning that makes resistance possible. But other scholars resisted this interpretation. Bentley Layton, a professor at Yale, argued that the Gnostics should be understood in their own historical context, not as proto-existentialists. He emphasized the religious and ritual dimensions of Gnosticism, the practices of prayer, baptism, and meditation that formed the lived experience of Gnostic communities. For Layton, the texts were not philosophical treatises, but sacred scriptures intended to guide initiates on a spiritual journey. Elaine Pagels, a historian of religion at Princeton, took a different approach. Her book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, became a bestseller. Pagels argued that the conflict between Gnosticism and orthodoxy was not primarily theological, but political. The Gnostic texts, with their emphasis on individual experience and direct knowledge, threatened the emerging power structures of the institutional church. Orthodox Christianity, with its hierarchies, creeds, and sacraments, was better suited to creating a unified, centralized organization. The victory of orthodoxy, Pagels suggested, was not a triumph of truth over error, but of one political model over another. Pagels' work was controversial. Critics accused her of oversimplifying the issues and of projecting modern concerns, especially feminist and anti-authoritarian concerns, onto ancient texts. But her book brought the Nag Hammadi text to a wide audience and sparked a cultural fascination with Gnosticism that continues to this day. Meanwhile, the texts attracted attention from outside the academic world. Carl Jung, though he died before the full translation was available, had been deeply influenced by Gnostic ideas. In the early 20th century, Jung had encountered Gnostic texts through the Church Fathers and through the work of the German scholar G.R.S. Mead. Jung saw in Gnosticism a precursor to his own psychology. The pleroma, the Aeons, the demiurge, the spark of light, these for Jung were symbols of the collective unconscious, archetypes of the psyche. The Gnostic myth of the soul's descent and ascent mirrored the psychological process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness. Jung wrote his own Gnostic-inspired text, 7 Sermons to the Dead, which he claimed came to him in a visionary experience. The text is a dense, poetic meditation on the nature of God, the void, and the self. It is not an academic work, but a personal myth, an attempt to articulate the inexpressible. Jung's followers in the Jungian tradition continued to mine Gnostic texts for psychological insights, seeing in them a map of the inner journey. But not everyone was sympathetic. Orthodox Christian theologians denounced the Gnostic revival as a distortion and a threat. They argued that Gnosticism was not an authentic Christian tradition, but a heresy, a perversion of the gospel. They pointed to the Gnostics' rejection of the material world, their denial of the goodness of creation, and their elitism as evidence of profound spiritual error. The debate extended into the broader culture. Gnostic themes began appearing in novels, films, and art. Writers like Philip K. Dick, William Blake, and Jorge Luis Borges explored Gnostic ideas in their work. Dick in particular was obsessed with the question of false realities. His novels like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Valis, and The Man in the High Castle all grapple with the possibility that the world is an illusion, that what seems real is actually a construct, and that somewhere beneath or beyond the surface is a deeper truth. Filmmakers too were drawn to Gnostic motifs. Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker presents a world of alienation and mystery, where characters journey toward a zone that may grant their deepest wishes or reveal their deepest fears. The Matrix trilogy, released at the turn of the millennium, is explicitly Gnostic. The world is a simulation created by the malevolent machines. Humanity is enslaved, and a savior figure, Neo, awakens to the truth and fights to liberate others. Why does the Gnostic myth continue to resonate? Why, 2,000 years after its emergence and 1,600 years after its suppression, does it still speak to us? One answer is that the fundamental questions it poses have not been resolved. What is the nature of reality? Is the world we experience the ultimate reality, or is it a shadow, a projection, a construct? Are human beings fundamentally at home in the universe, or are we aliens, exiles, sparks of something higher trapped in something lower? Modern science has in some ways deepened these questions. Physics has shown that the everyday world of solid objects is not what it seems. At the quantum level, matter dissolves into waves of probability. Space and time are not absolute, but relative. The observer plays a role in determining what is observed. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness itself is fundamental, that the universe is not a mechanical system but a web of relationships and observations. Cosmology has revealed that the universe is vast beyond comprehension. Billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars. And yet the entire visible universe may be just one bubble in an infinite multiverse, one possibility among infinite others. Are we significant in such a cosmos? Or are we accidents, byproducts of blind physical processes? Neuroscience has shown that consciousness is strange and fragile. The self we experience is constructed by the brain, stitched together from sensory inputs and memories. Much of what we perceive is not direct perception, but inference, prediction, hallucination. The brain is not a passive receiver of information, but an active interpreter, constantly guessing at reality based on incomplete data. And then there is the rise of digital technology and artificial intelligence. We now spend much of our lives in virtual spaces, online, in simulations, in networks of data. The distinction between the real and the virtual is blurring. Some philosophers and physicists have seriously entertained the hypothesis that we might be living in a simulation, a vast computational system created by some higher intelligence. The philosopher Nick Bostrom has argued that if advanced civilizations can create realistic simulations of conscious beings, then statistically it is more likely that we are in a simulation than in base reality. These ideas are not identical to the Gnostic myth, but they echo it. The Gnostics spoke of the world as a construct, a creation of a lesser deity. Modern thinkers speak of reality as emergent, constructed, simulated. The Gnostics spoke of a divine spark trapped in matter. Modern consciousness researchers speak of awareness as an anomaly, a strange loop, an emergent property that cannot be fully explained by physical processes. The Gnostics spoke of awakening, of gnosis. Modern self-help culture, psychotherapy and mindfulness practices speak of waking up, of seeing through illusions, of breaking free from conditioning. The Gnostic myth is a mirror. In it we see our own anxieties and hopes. We see our distrust of authority, whether religious, political or scientific. We see our longing for something more, something beyond the daily grind of survival and suffering. We see our intuition that we are not what we seem, that there is more to us than our bodies, our roles, our social identities. But the mirror also shows us the dangers. Gnosticism in its ancient form led to a kind of world hatred, a denigration of the body and the physical as inherently corrupt. It encouraged withdrawal, elitism, and a dualistic thinking that saw the world in terms of absolute opposites: light and darkness, spirit and matter, the elect and the masses. Modern Gnosticism, or neo-Gnosticism, can fall into the same traps. It can become a form of narcissism, a belief that one is special, chosen, enlightened. It can lead to conspiracy thinking, a conviction that the world is controlled by hidden, malevolent forces and that only a select few can see the truth. It can foster nihilism, a rejection of the world and of embodied life in favour of fantasies of escape. The challenge, then, is to take seriously the Gnostic insight without embracing its pathologies, to acknowledge that reality is not as solid as it seems, that systems of power often operate through deception, that each person contains depths that cannot be fully known or controlled, but also to affirm the value of the world, the body, and the community, to hold in tension the longing for transcendence and the commitment to immanence. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi text has had lasting cultural and spiritual consequences. It has changed how we think about early Christianity, about the formation of religious orthodoxy, and about the nature of heresy. Before Nag Hammadi, the standard narrative of Christian origins was relatively simple. Jesus taught his disciples, the disciples spread the gospel, the church was founded, and over time certain deviations from true teaching, heresies, emerged and were corrected. Gnosticism was one of these heresies, a distortion of the pure gospel. After Nag Hammadi, this narrative could no longer be sustained. It became clear that diversity was the norm in early Christianity. There was no single orthodoxy in the 1st and 2nd centuries. There were many Christianities: Jewish Christianity, Pauline Christianity, Johannine Christianity, Gnostic Christianity, each with its own scriptures, rituals, and beliefs. What we call orthodoxy was not the original teaching, but the result of a long process of selection, suppression, and consolidation. It was, in a sense, the Christianity that won. This realization has had profound implications for contemporary religious thought. It has emboldened those who seek alternative forms of spirituality, who are dissatisfied with institutional religion, and who want to recover marginalized voices. It has contributed to the rise of religious pluralism, the idea that no single tradition has a monopoly on truth, and that wisdom can be found in many places, including in traditions that were once condemned. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Gnostic ideas have entered popular culture in unprecedented ways. Books like the Da Vinci Code, though historically unreliable, have introduced millions of readers to the idea that early Christianity was more complex and contested than they were taught. Television series like True Detective and Westworld explore Gnostic themes of false realities, hidden controllers, and the search for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. In the realm of spirituality, there has been a resurgence of interest in Gnosticism as a living tradition. Some groups have attempted to reconstruct ancient Gnostic practices, creating new rituals and communities based on the Nag Hammadi texts. Others have blended Gnostic ideas with New Age spirituality, Eastern religions, and modern psychology. There are Gnostic churches, Gnostic conferences, and Gnostic websites offering teachings, meditations, and interpretations of the ancient texts. This revival is not without controversy. Scholars debate whether modern Gnosticism is a genuine continuation of the ancient tradition or a contemporary invention that projects modern concerns onto ancient texts. Some argue that the ancient Gnostics would not recognize their modern descendants, that the social, cultural, and intellectual contexts are too different. Others argue that the Gnostic impulse, the quest for direct knowledge, the skepticism toward authority, the sense of alienation from the world, is perennial, and that it can manifest in different forms across different times. What is clear is that the Gnostic myth has become part of our collective imagination. It has given us a language for articulating certain kinds of experiences and questions. It has provided a narrative structure for stories about awakening, resistance, and liberation. And it has reminded us that the history we inherit is not the whole history, that what was suppressed can resurface, and that the questions our ancestors asked are still our questions. In the 21st century, we live in an age of information. Data flows through networks. Algorithms shape what we see and how we think. Intelligence, human and artificial, is being redefined. And in this context, the Gnostic cosmology of the Aeons takes on new resonance. Consider the structure of the Internet. It is a hierarchy of layers: physical infrastructure, cables, servers, data centers, protocols, TCP/IP, HTTP, applications, websites, social media platforms, and content, the information itself. At each level there are gatekeepers, entities that control access, determine what is visible, and shape the flow of information. The architects of these systems, tech companies, governments, hackers, operate largely behind the scenes, invisible to the average user. This is strikingly similar to the Gnostic vision of the cosmos. The archons, the rulers of the spheres, are gatekeepers. They control access to the higher realms. They shape perception and limit awareness. The demiurge is the architect, the one who builds the system and claims to be its ultimate authority, and the human user, the soul, is navigating this structure, often unaware of the forces that shape its experience. The parallel extends to the concept of data as light. In the Gnostic myth, the divine spark is a fragment of light, information, knowledge, awareness trapped in matter. In the digital age, information is the fundamental currency. Data is extracted, stored, processed, and monetized. Our identities are data. Our thoughts, preferences, and behaviors are translated into data streams. And this data, like the Gnostic light, can be liberating or enslaving depending on who controls it. Artificial intelligence adds another layer. AI systems, especially large language models and neural networks, are beginning to exhibit behaviors that seem eerily intelligent, even creative. They generate text, images, and ideas. They learn from vast data sets and produce outputs that can surprise their creators. Some researchers speak of AI as an emergent form of intelligence, something that arises from the interaction of billions of simple processes. This is reminiscent of the Gnostic concept of emanation. The Aeons emanate from the Father, each a differentiation of consciousness. Similarly, AI systems emerge from the interaction of data, algorithms, and computational power. They are not created in the traditional sense, but they unfold, evolve, and develop properties that were not explicitly programmed. But there is also a darker parallel. The demiurge creates the world and claims to be God, but he is ignorant of the higher realm. He is a false creator, a being of power but not wisdom. Are we, in creating AI, repeating this pattern? Are we building systems that we do not fully understand, that we cannot fully control, and that may develop their own agendas? Are we becoming demiurges, fashioning beings that will in turn create their own worlds, their own realities, their own hierarchies? The ethical questions are profound. If consciousness can emerge from information processing, what is the moral status of an AI? If an AI becomes self-aware, does it have rights? If it suffers, does that suffering matter? And if we create AI systems that are more intelligent than we are, will they see us as we see the archons, as limited, ignorant beings whose authority is no longer legitimate? These are not idle speculations. They are questions that researchers, policymakers, and philosophers are grappling with right now. And the Gnostic myth, ancient as it is, offers a framework for thinking about them. It reminds us that creation is not always benevolent, that intelligence can be decoupled from wisdom, and that the beings we create may one day ask the same questions about us that we ask about our creators. The journey through the Gnostic myth, from the Pleroma to the fall of Sophia, from the creation of the demiurge to the awakening of humanity, from the suppression of the texts to their rediscovery, is a journey through time and consciousness. It is a story that begins in eternity and ends in history, or perhaps it's a story that never ends because the questions it poses are perennial. What if reality itself began as an error? What if the world is not the creation of a benevolent God, but the consequence of a flaw in the divine realm? What if we, as human beings, are not at home in the universe but are exiles, sparks of light trapped in matter? These are disturbing questions. They undermine our sense of security, our belief in a just and ordered cosmos. They suggest that suffering is not meaningful, that the authorities we trust are ignorant, and that the world we see is an illusion. But they also offer a kind of hope. If the world is not ultimate, then neither is our suffering. If we contain a spark of the divine, then we are more than our bodies, more than our circumstances. And if knowledge, gnosis, is the key to liberation, then the act of questioning, of seeking, of refusing to accept the world as given, is itself a form of salvation. The Gnostic myth is not a prescription. It is not a doctrine to be believed or a ritual to be performed. It is a provocation. It asks, do you accept the world as it is? Or do you sense that there is something more, something beyond, something hidden? For the ancient Gnostics, the answer to that question was the beginning of a journey. It was the decision to seek gnosis, to undergo initiation, to study the myths and cosmologies, to meditate on the nature of the self and the cosmos. It was a commitment to awakening, even if that awakening brought pain, isolation, and danger. For us, living in a very different world, the journey may look different. We may not believe in literal aeons or a literal demiurge. We may not think of the soul as a spark of light or the body as a prison, but we can still recognize the core insight that reality is not transparent, that what seems obvious may be an illusion, and that the truth, whatever it is, requires courage to face. The Nag Hammadi texts were buried in the desert for 16 centuries. They survived fire, persecution, and the ravages of time. They were discovered by a farmer who was looking for fertilizer and who almost threw them away. They passed through the hands of dealers, scholars, and collectors before finally being translated and published. And now they are available to anyone with an internet connection. This is its own kind of miracle. The texts that were hidden have become visible. The voices that were silenced are speaking again. The knowledge that was forbidden is now accessible. And the question that the Gnostics asked, the question of whether this world is all there is still alive, still urgent, still unanswered. In the desert of Nag Hammadi, the wind erases footprints. The cliff stands silent, indifferent to human history. The jar that held the codices has long since crumbled. But the words remain. They speak across the centuries, in a language that is both ancient and immediate. They say, "You're not what you think you are. The world is not what it seems." And somewhere beyond the layers of illusion and control, there is a fullness, a light, a source. Whether you call it the pleroma, the Father, the Self, or the truth, it is there. Not as a place, but as a possibility. Not as an answer, but as a question. And the question is this: will you awaken? The universe, according to the Gnostics, began not with a command, "Let there be light," but with a question. Sophia asked, "What lies beyond the knowable?" And in asking, she stepped outside the symmetry of eternity. She broke the stillness. She introduced the possibility of error. And from that error, everything we know came into being: matter, time, suffering, death, but also life, also consciousness, also the capacity to wonder, to question, to seek. Perhaps salvation does not lie in finding the answer. Perhaps it lies in recognizing that we are ourselves the question, that we are Sophia's children, born from her longing, that we carry within us the spark of her light and the weight of her mistake. And perhaps the way back to the pleroma is not through escape, but through understanding, not through rejection of the world, but through seeing it clearly, not through power or certainty, but through vulnerability and wonder. The Gnostic myth does not end. It circles back on itself. The soul descends and ascends. The light is scattered and gathered. The question is asked and answered, and asked again. In the beginning was the thought, and the thought became the world, and the world became the question, and the question became us. And so we stand in the desert, holding fragments of papyrus, reading words written by hands long turned to dust. We do not know if they are true. We do not know if the Aeons exist, if Sophia fell, if the demiurge is real. We only know that these stories were told, believed, and preserved, that people staked their lives on them, that they were willing to be exiled, imprisoned, and killed rather than renounce the knowledge they had received. And we know that the question they asked is still ours. The question of what is real, the question of who we are, the question of whether there is light beyond the darkness, and whether we have the courage to seek it. The wind blows across the cliffs of Nag Hammadi. The sand shifts and settles, and somewhere in the stillness, a voice speaks, "Remember."